Well, on a Monday, we like to catch up on the political agenda for the week ahead. Wendy Francis, the National Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby, and a special day today, Wendy's last official update before hanging up the gloves in the battle for biblical Christian values in her role with the Australian Christian Lobby. You might know, Wendy, that she's had a long connection to Vision too as a member of our board. Hey, Wendy Francis, a special welcome along to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. It is a special time, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that I've had over a number of years now to talk with you. I'm just so grateful to you. Thank you.
And I might say we're talking to you today from Darwin, where you're sitting out in the warmth, a wonderful warm Darwin day, as it is mostly. And so you're in Darwin. Are you on business, or is this a pleasure trip?
I am on business, but it is a pleasure trip as well. So we love to visit our family up here. But I've worked in Darwin over a number of years with the ACL on and off, and so I am doing some work up here this week as well. So I love Darwin, but you're right, it is always warm. So I'm outside under a fan, and it's beautiful.
Hey, I want to especially honour you today for all of your years of service with the ACL, and regular listeners will know that you've been a constant voice on 2020 over many, many years now. But before we get into that, I do want to touch on whatever might be the most high priorities on the political agenda for the coming week, because I know that there are a lot of listeners to this program that tune in, and especially on a Monday morning, they know that when we talk to the ACL, we're talking about those issues that really matter when it comes to a Christian context around values and political policy and the way our nation is moving. So I wonder if we might just touch on a couple of quick things before we have a bit of a reflection on your long service with the ACL. Let me just touch on the likelihood or the possibility of a judicial inquiry being called into anti-Semitism and primarily focused around Australian universities. What's coming up on the agenda this week?
Yeah, look, there's an envoy against anti-Semitism that has risen up and called for a judicial inquiry, and they are also calling for a number of other things. They're calling for a national hotline, an anti-Semitism brief for a student ombudsman, a number of other measures as well, because this has arisen because of the sit-ins at the universities that no one wants legal protests to be banned. No one wants students not to be able to give their opinions on campuses. But when we've got students who are disobeying laws and camping out and calling for death for a certain group of people in Australia, then yes, I think an inquiry is a good thing, because we've now got vice chancellors having to apologise for the behaviour of their students on campus and for not clamping down and making sure that every student is safe. This is what we need to see on student campuses around Australia. We need to know that every student is valued and every student is safe. So, yeah, we would like to see this inquiry happen, and certainly there's a rising call for it.
And of course, it's not just students who are under that intimidation, but it's also the teachers, the lecturers at universities who've come under real stress and feeling very unsafe in that environment. So I imagine that if there is a inquiry into what happens on university campuses around anti-Semitism, that might actually have some wider-ranging effects across the general society. Is that the hope, that if that gets up, there'll be a wider-ranging feeling about how these things need to be dealt with?
Absolutely. I think what we need to see through the inquiry is to find out where is this coming from, because it is very un-Australian, to be honest, to target a certain group in a hateful way. But we've seen it through Parliament as well, Neil. Very prominent Jewish MP, Julian Leeser, he's had a number of pretty hateful attacks against him, simply not because of his policies, not because of what he is saying, simply because of his heritage. And this just can't happen in Australia.
Okay, we'll be keeping an eye on that particular inquiry. Hey, there's another big issue that's brewing along, and one that is, I guess, in some ways a bit of a triumph. And on your outgoing week, South Australia is introducing a prostitution bill this week and providing some exit strategies, and these sorts of things are often incremental in the way that you might fight back against dreadful laws. But give us an insight into what's going on in South Australia.
Yeah, it is quite exciting for me this week, to be honest, because you would know that for many years I've been advocating for the Nordic model of prostitution legislation, which actually sees the girls who are in, and it is mainly girls, who are caught up in prostitution. It sees them as being victims of a system that they need to be able to escape from if they need to. So what we're seeing in Australia at the moment is a move to make prostitution the same as any other job. And in that way, there is no need for anybody to be helped to escape or to be helped to remove themselves from a dangerous situation. In any other job, if there are dangers, then they are recognised and they are mitigated against, but not in prostitution. So what we're seeing in South Australia, and South Australia often have led the way in terms of women's rights in Australia. They were the first state to give women the right to vote. So they are one of the states that move ahead on women's rights. And they are, Nicola Centifanti, one of the MPs there, is introducing a bill this week that would provide exit strategies for women and everybody caught up in prostitution. So it would recognise the fact that there are times when women need to be able to escape from this, what is an exploitative industry, and the government would provide a means of escape and a way for these women to be rehabilitated into a job that they would see as being something that would provide them dignity.
And with that bill in South Australia, that may be, as you say, a nation-leading initiative so far as our parliaments, because our parliaments right around Australia have deteriorated in such a way around prostitution that basically anything goes in most states and territories right now. So things are pretty dire on the prostitution front in Australia, aren't they?
It really is, and it goes to why I've been so passionate about ACL for the length of time I have, Neil, because I think if you go back to some of the heroes in our history, of global history, and we look at someone like Wilberforce, one of the things that, he did fight for the abolition of slavery, but he also fought for a reintroduction of what he called manners. And when he's talking about manners, he's not talking about how we fold our serviette or where we put our fork. He's talking about the way that we deal with individual people, particularly people in need. And so in his day, prostitution was in every street corner. We had children going begging because they were poor. We had just a complete disintegration of what he called manners. And look, we might not be at that stage, but we are close approaching that stage, particularly with something like prostitution, where now prostitution is legal even in our suburbs. And what concerns me, and I know that you would know this from the years that we've talked, is I'm not so concerned about the suburbs as I am concerned about the women who are caught up in this industry and whose lives are being destroyed. The ones that the majority of them come out with PTSD, the same as people who've been fighting in Iraq. Like, we're talking about human beings who are being exploited. So when we go back to the thought of Wilberforce, he was fighting for a return to manners. And I think this is what we have been fighting for here in Australia. And sadly, we are at a low ebb in our understanding of true manners in that sense.
Okay, all eyes will be on South Australia to see what happens as that bill is being debated this week. Hey, let's move on to just remembering some things so far as your history goes, Wendy Francis, because from what I can calculate, you've been with the ACL since 2011. So, you know, we're all disappointed, and I know there's a wonderful team at ACL, and, you know, they're going to find their feet without you, but it's going to be a real shock to have you not on the team, no doubt. But 2011, you started with ACL, and that came out of, you'd been a candidate just before that in a Family First Senate ticket in the state of Queensland. And when that didn't get up, you moved into a lobbying role with the Australian Christian Lobby. And I remember those early days too, and talking about making the outdoors G-rated and those sorts of things that really did strike a chord with so many Australians. What are you going to be remembering about your time with ACL and the things that, you know, there's lots of achievements and there's lots of battles that have been in there and it hasn't all been comfortable, but what are you going to remember as you're now preparing to say farewell?
So I'm remembering a season of incredible growth in my own personal life, to be honest. When I ran for Family First, I was quite green as far as understanding politics, but it was such a good entry into ACL for me to have run because it was a very steep learning curve. Bob Day was running at the time and he was running Family First, and I learned an enormous amount from Bob Day. And I got to understand the system, and I got to see how difficult it is to even have friends in politics. And I'm not talking about Family First because I had good friends in Family First, but boy, oh boy, it was a rough time. And then by the end of 2010, that was when Jim Wallace first approached me and said, look, we've seen what you're doing with the outdoor advertising stuff, because that was my passion at the time. And he said, what do you think about joining ACL? So from the start of 2011, I put my hand up and said, yes, I want to be part of ACL. So I think what I'll remember is just gratefulness for the opportunity. In my national role, I moved into a national role under Martin Miles, and in that role, I've walked the halls of federal parliament freely with a pass that allows me to do that. And the opportunity, I guess, to speak to MPs about policy, but more than that, about Jesus, to be able to keep confidences with them, to be able to encourage them when they need it. It's not an easy job. And not just MPs, but staffers as well. All of that, I guess, is what I will take with me. But yeah, there's been some sad losses, but there's been some amazing advances as well. And I think of the prostitution legislation is one of the ones that I really do believe we've made an impact. The Babies Born Alive issue, and you would know from talking to people like Lyle and other people, none of these things happen just from ACL. This is a joint effort. But certainly ACL's got a very large reach and a good reputation. And so we've been able to use that brand, I guess, to back up others as well when they're calling for things. But this is across the board. And certainly with the advertising, we've seen a big change in what is allowed on billboards. We are nowhere near good enough. And I will still continue as a grandmother and as a supporter of ACL and as a volunteer now. I will be still supporting them in that. But even with religious freedom, I think probably nobody really knows how much we've been able to hold back through the work of ACL. So being given that opportunity to speak truth to power in love, and I really have tried very hard to do that truth in love, that's been an enormous privilege for me.
And, you know, when you say holding back all of those issues and the valuable work of the ACL, some people might be thinking, oh, she must be talking about all of those bad things in the Labor Party. But actually, this is all the bad things on every side. So-called conservatives don't necessarily have better values than those on the left side. I wonder if you've got any reflection over all these years. And I'm asking for an honest response here. An honest response, both sides, and the deterioration of values in our nation. How do you reflect on that?
So it was a Conservative government that brought in safe schools. Safe schools should sound as if it's a really good thing. But Safe Schools led to respectful relationships, and both of those curriculums through our school education system, not just in our schools, but in our universities and in our preschools and in our kindies, that has led to the explosion of gender ideology confusion for our children. So it was under a Conservative government that Safe Schools was first introduced and funded. And when it first came out, I have to say, ACL, and I went into this deep dive, and this would be something interesting to talk to Lyle about as well, Lyle Shelton, because he, at the start, when I told him how bad I believed that Safe Schools was, I think he felt that perhaps I was overreacting because it was so bad. But when I showed him what was in the curriculum, he just got straight on board, and we were very quick to push back on Safe Schools. And we managed to get it banned in a few different states, but unfortunately it morphed into other things. But, that was brought in under a Conservative government. The government is, no matter what party it is, government is not the answer. Jesus is the answer for Australia. But we certainly work with people across each party, because there are good people, there are godly people in both major parties and in a number of the minor parties as well. And I think the minor parties have a real part to play in this too. They do tend to keep the government honest, particularly as we're heading into a federal election, Neil. We could well see a minority government happening because the numbers are shaping up that's possible. So what we really need in a minority government are good cross-party, minor party people sitting on those crossbenches, and so that's what I'll be praying for. But yeah, we've seen good and bad from both parties. I think the longer a government is in power, there's also a potential for them to take people for granted. So that also plays into it, I think.
Yeah. Hey, when you came to a national level of prominence in your role with the Australian Christian Lobby, because you started off being the Queensland State Director, and then they promoted you, and I think you probably had something to do with it too, but you were leading what was called the Centre for Human Dignity. Right back to 2017, and of course listeners will remember that was the year of the same-sex marriage debate and all of the challenges, all of the really difficult initiatives that were talked about in that time. And these days, you're called the national head of politics. And so politics has been your main focus over these past few years. And I don't know, imagine that you're going to be passing the baton on to someone else within the ACL. I'll let them announce what that might be. But you've had this opportunity at a high level to be able to knock on doors and meet people in corridors. And that's been a really useful and valuable time, no doubt. You probably have as many sad stories as you do good stories, but there are good stories in the mix as well, aren't there?
There really are, Neil. And you mentioned the Centre for Human Dignity, and I really loved that period of time. That was under Lyle Shelton's leadership. But what we did in the centre, we've continued to do through ACL. The centre wanted to primarily focus on what we're talked about even with Wilberforce and the manners, and this is re-engaging with the value of every human life. And so that crosses into, of course, the prostitution and human trafficking, but it also crosses into abortion, it crosses into euthanasia, it crosses across every border, really, the religious freedom border as well, because that's recognising that human beings have the right to choose how they will worship. So the centre really gave me a platform to speak to not just Christians, but across the board. And that opened up a lot of doors that we continue to have now with feminist groups or with libertarian groups, because many times what we find is what we're fighting for is along the lines of other groups as well. And so that was a good opportunity. So all of these opportunities have opened doors. Some of them have lasted longer. The centre didn't last for a really long time, but it opened all those doors that have continued to work in our favour, because when I walk into a meeting, people see a Christian grandmother, which is what I am, someone who's very passionate. But when I take in a feminist or a libertarian with me and we're all saying the same thing, it's quite powerful.
You know, passionate, you might be a Christian grandma, and you say passionate, but also very courageous, because you've been on the receiving end of what we call lawfare. You've been dragged before some lower level courts, and oftentimes we talk about the process being the punishment. You've been through all of that, and that certainly is on the rise. You're leaving your role with some unattended things here, because whoever does take on your role and those others who follow in your footsteps, yep, they're in for a tough time, aren't they?
It is tough, but you know, I think when you're in the centre of God's will, He puts wind beneath your wings. So I have actually really enjoyed the toughness of it, even though there have been times when I've gone home and really cried to my husband, Peter. But I think when you are in the centre of God's will, that's where you're going to flourish. And I have flourished over these 14 years. You know, we have visited missionaries on many different mission fields, and I come away thinking, I don't know how they can do this. It's so hard here. But they flourish and they love it, because that's exactly where God has placed them. And even though it's hard, they love it because they are in the centre of God's will. And so I would encourage everybody, even if it's hard, if that's where God has put you, He will give you a joy in the journey. And it's certainly what He's done for me, despite those hard times. And particularly, as you say, the times when I've been dragged before courts and things, that has not been very pleasant at all.
Well, Wendy, you and Peter as a Baptist pastor and the principal of Malyon College in Brisbane, he's also going to retire as well. You're retiring together. So what should we be thinking of you in retirement? Putting your feet up, on a sandy, sunny beach somewhere in the world? Are you expecting to travel, or what are your plans for retirement?
You know, most of our travel over the years has been to missions places, so we would like to travel if God allows us to do that. But I have started a website, wendyfrancis.com.au. I'm normally sprouting off the acl.org.au, and I still do. Please, everybody, go to acl.org.au. But I've started a website, wendyfrancis.com.au, and I am going to be sharing my thoughts on that, and I would like to stay engaged. I will be volunteering with ACL because I believe in them so incredibly much. But we would also like to spend more time with our grandchildren. That's something that I just so enjoy to do. And I do believe that grandparents have an incredible opportunity to speak into their grandchildren's lives. So I'll be doing that as well. But I certainly won't be dropping out of public life. I will be doing all the things that I've encouraged other people to do over the years, because I haven't just said it because it's a job. I've said it because I really believe in it.
Well, Wendy, you've run countless Meet the Candidates forums, especially around your home state of Queensland, but I know you've done that interstate as well. I know that listeners will join in like a corporate prayer of blessing on you and Peter. And thank you so much for all of the good work that you've done over so many years with the ACL, but you've been involved in public life for a long, long time, even before that. And I know that listeners will want to join in with a corporate prayer of blessing on the next steps for you and Peter as you go into retirement. And I want to thank you for all these years of wonderful updates on 2020 and lots of the issues. They've been very significant issues, and you've been a primary voice for values in our nation. So thank you so much, Wendy Francis. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Neil. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And you can connect with Wendy. She mentioned her new website, wendyfrancis.com.au. And, of course, to catch up on the Australian Christian lobby and where they're at, resources in understanding the developments that are happening in our Australian society, you can get that acl.org.au website, acl.org.au. Wendy Francis, the National Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby. Wendy, thanks so much for being with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil.